Hello everyone, this is GamesWithFrank and welcome back to the channel. We'll be starting off with C# for Playmaker users. We'll be looking at why we're covering C# in the first place. I'll show you one such case where we ran into this issue when we were doing the cozy exploration tutorial series and we had to make a really complicated FSM in order to get around it, and C# can easily do that. And we'll be covering that part today. It is not going to be a traditional follow-along tutorial. All the syntax and all that learning will come later in the series in a more detailed manner. So here I've got a simple empty scene. So if you remember from the dialog system that we were making, we ran into an issue where the dialog type should be either of 3. So if I open Excalibur, this was our mind map initially, and there are 3 interaction types. One is the dialogue for the player, one is a dialogue for the NPC, and third one is options. First, we needed to identify if the interaction type was either of the 3, and if it was either of these 2, then there will be a text, and if it was an option, then it'll take a string array, and depending on the string array, it would then take responses and so on. So if I select this game object and go to Playmaker and create an FSM, and if I look for enum type variable, I'll just call it interaction type. And you can see that if I open up enum type, if I select any variable here, you can notice that these are drop-downs. It is much more like our requirement where we have an interaction type and there will be a drop-down where we can select the player, NPC, and the options. So basically that's what we need. So it is a type of variable called enumerator. And unfortunately in Playmaker we can't create. If I search for enum, you can see that it can set an enumerator value, but we can't quite make a variable as such. So for that, probably you'll need to download some extra actions from the ecosystem and so on and so forth. But we're looking at how to solve that in C#, and that is pretty much simple. So if I go to create C# script, and I'll call this interaction, and you'll need something like Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code to open up these C# files. You can have any IDE for that matter. So you can try to understand what I'm writing here, but we'll cover the explanation in a more detailed manner later on when we get into the series. And if I enter an interaction type, and this is going to be dialogue player, dialogue NPC, and these are options. And I can just go ahead and create an interaction type and store this as interaction 1. Now you don't need to understand all of that, but we'll be covering it pretty soon in the series. But this is just to give you an idea of how simple it is to solve things that are not available in Playmaker. So if I click and drag this over here, you can see that we've just created what we exactly needed, right? So this is an interaction 1, and that it can be a dialogue of the player, dialogue of the NPC, or options. So we can leave it at this, or we can go one step ahead and create a string array. And these are options. And you can create a string for the dialogue text. So if I save it, it will recompile and it should show up the options and the dialog text. Now if it is selected to options, only then we'll read these options. And let's say option 1, test. Options 2, test. This is a dialog text. Test. And we literally have whatever we wanted to create in the Cozy Exploration series conversation system in a few lines of code. And you can work alongside Playmaker. So if I click and drag this interaction script inside state 1, and I'll get the property, and I'll select interaction 1, and this is going to store the type of the enumerator. So I'll just call this type and go to variables. And you can see that it's not recognizing the type of enumerator. So if you search in this list and if I hit I, you can see that interaction type is mentioned here. And I'll change its type. So I'll make this an output. And similarly, let's just get the options list. And I'm going to store it and call this options list every frame. And we might as well get the dialog text as well. So if I mark these variables as outputs, we can look at these here. I'll just save the scene and hit play. And now what it needs to do is take every variable from the interaction script and display it here. And it's working perfectly fine. If I change this to 5 options and 3, 4, 5, and it'll update in Playmaker as and when we update it here. So you can see that it's working perfectly. If I change the options, that also gets updated. So this is how Playmaker and C# interact with each other. And that's basically what you need to know about making things in C#. And in the next tutorial, we'll be covering the basics of how to implement a trigger system. So we'll take the basics of Playmaker probably from Hutong Games' Introduction to Playmaker series, and we'll translate each Playmaker FSM into a script so that you'll understand the mapping, and we'll get into a lot more detail than this tutorial. I hope you learned something from this video. I'll see you in the next one. This is GamesWithFrank signing out.